Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up, and make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video, and yeah, let's begin. All right, what's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Venom Beyond. Here's the thing, man. I love the way that Donny Cates writes this, right? Because I fired this book up, and I'd say within the span of 5 minutes, I was done, right? I just ripped through this book. And to me, that's a testament of how good a comic book is, right? If I can just if I find myself just ripping through it, and I feel like I'm done before I even started, that's just how good the comic book is written, right? So, this kind of gives us, at least as much as Donny Cates gives us anyway, the way in which the world fell under the rule of Venom's son. We're not given a whole ton of stuff here, and in reality, we probably don't need to be, but the idea here is that at some point in the past, in this alternate reality, that there was, you basically had, Anne Weying, who of course was possessed by her Venom symbiote, and more or less operating as what amounts to Agent Venom, alongside Spider-Man, who ended up defeating Dr. Octopus, right, in some campaign that was called Octopi Wall Street. It was kind of goofy, but Anne Weying basically reveals that she's pregnant here. Now, this is what's kind of bonkers, is Donny Cates doesn't necessarily seem to have given us the indication that Eddie Brock is the one who got her pregnant. It's just simply that Eddie Brock, Eddie Brock and her were married at one point in a relationship. If we follow a reasonable timeline here, we don't definitively know when it was that Eddie Brock shot himself. We're not told here in this particular comic that 3 days after Eddie Brock shot himself, we're not really told that. Instead, it's just Eddie Brock ended up killing himself in the bell tower, and then Anne went there and she ended up getting the Venom symbiote, right? So we don't really know how much time has passed. I would expect that under most circumstances, whenever a woman realizes she's pregnant, it's usually because as she goes through her womanly times that she realizes that she's not doing the things she's supposed to be doing, and as a result of that, we can largely assume that at most a month has passed since Eddie Brock died. By whatever manner and whatever means, if we assume that Eddie Brock is the one who got her pregnant, then that makes sense. We could also kind of assume that it's like a miraculous conception, right? That the symbiote ultimately just ended up creating an offspring inside of her. Again, we're not given a definitive answer here. We just kind of have to swing for the fences, because when she's sitting down with Peter Parker and she tells Peter Parker that she's pregnant, when he asks who the father is, she's like, I don't know. Now, the third option here is that Anne's just really promiscuous, and any number of guys out there could be the dad, right? We just don't know, right? It's like an episode of Maury Povich, right? You bring 20 guys on there, none of them are the father, right? You have no idea which one it is, so that's also an option too, right? But whatever it is, she ended up being pregnant, and of course, that was Dylan, right? She ended up being, getting pregnant and having Dylan. The crazy thing about this is Peter Parker basically talks about, hey, it's gonna be tough being a single mom. I was kind of raised there, but if you ever need any help, I'm here. And her response is, I'm not a single mom, right? I have Venom, and so between the two of us, we can raise this kid to become, a productive member of society, right? We'll just be fun, we'll be just fine. And so what you end up finding out here is that as time passed and Dylan grew up and got to the age that he is now in the main Marvel universe, that he grew up as any kind of a normal kid does, right? He had his good moments, his bad moments, right? Kids misbehave, they push boundaries, different things like that, and so he did what any normal kid does. But then one day she came home and all those different drawings were on the walls, right? The drawings of the Grendel. And that's kind of the telltale signature of Knull, the symbiote god. And so what she basically shows here is that at some point along the line, that Knull ended up taking over Dylan, right? Now this, I believe, is shown in a one-shot comic that focuses on Knull basically getting his hands on Dylan and influencing him and actually teaching him how to use his powers, or at least teaching him the base on how his powers work. And then the rest was kind of left to Dylan from there. But one of the things to keep in mind, for those of you guys who are a little behind here, Knull the symbiote god was Donny Cates' invention. And what he basically did is he introduced this idea that where Brian Michael Bendis had previously given us this explanation of the symbiotes, in the sense that Venom was not a one-off, right? The Venom actually comes from a planet of symbiotes, and those symbiotes are ideally space knights, right? So they basically bond themselves to a host, and they go forward as protectors of the universe, that sometimes a symbiote can be corrupted. And that's what happened. That in the original Secret Wars, Peter Parker came in contact with a symbiote, and he was supposed to be a space knight of sorts, right? Like a protector using the symbiote. The result was that once he was told by Reed Richards in the old Web of Spider-Man comics that the symbiote was an actual sentient being, and that the things that Peter was doing were basically because the symbiote was acting of its own accord, that Peter cast it off. And in doing so, that corrupted the Venom symbiote. And that's how it ended up becoming, quote unquote, a bad guy. And then basically bonded itself to Eddie Brock later on, and that's the whole history of Venom in the main main Marvel universe. The idea was that when Donny Cates came along, Donny Cates said, everything that Brian Michael Bendis said with the Planet of the Symbiotes is still intact, but I'm adding on to it. And he created Knull. And Knull was the person who created the symbiotes in the first place. He created them as basically his henchmen. And that once Knull was ultimately defeated and kind of cast back into the void, or at least, kind of locked within his own planet, more or less, and surrounded by all these symbiotes, the symbiotes then in turn became more or less autonomous. And that's when they formed their idea of becoming protectors as opposed to henchmen of Knull. With Knull basically re-emerging in the aftermath of absolute carnage, that Knull began to exercise his control over the symbiotes yet again. That's really where this comes from, in the sense that Knull basically reached out from his place within the multiverse and has influenced this version of Dylan and basically taken him over, right? In the sense that like Dylan now kind of operates seemingly as an agent of Knull. And the result of this is that he ended up taking a piece of his mom's symbiote and then used it to create his own symbiote. Following that, he ended up taking off to a different location, and this is kind of us reading between the lines, or at least from what Anne's telling us, that he ended up going to basically the bell tower and then in turn started spawning off all these different symbiotes and then controlling them and then rejecting them. And this was designed for the purpose of him basically creating symbiotes and then kind of usurping his control over those symbiotes and sending them forward. In response to this growing symbiote threat, President Flash Thompson ended up creating Anne Weying and the Agent Venom force, more or less. And in doing that, the idea was to take on the forces of Dylan. The issue here is that by the time they realized that Dylan was literally a credible threat, it was simply too late. That with these symbiotes he had created, he had basically forced them onto the superheroes and some of the supervillains and turned them into his symbiote henchmen. And so he literally laid waste to virtually any other superhero and villain that was left, right? Killed pretty much all the superheroes and all the supervillains on Earth. Following that, and with the death of President Flash Thompson, Dylan essentially made himself a dictator, right? He made himself absolute ruler of the Earth and then sent his symbiotes around the world and started basically taking over everybody around there, right? Like the average person. And that's kind of what Anne says, is that Dylan killed the world, that he essentially conquered the world by using Venom symbiotes. And that's why this is just a Venomized world, right? All the heroes, all the villains are all symbiotes. Now, some of these heroes are actually heroes who have been taken over by symbiotes. Some of these heroes are just Venom symbiotes looking like heroes, right? Like, kind of appearing as these individuals. It's kind of a mishmash of these different things. But the long and short of this is that the concern of Anne is that Dylan could essentially fall down the same way. And this comes in a couple different forms. The first form this takes is her asking Eddie, does Dylan have these powers? Now, keep in mind, this is a highly emotional situation for Anne because one, like she lost her son, right? She lost her son to the power of Knull, and there doesn't really seem to be a way to bring him back. The other part of this is that she is kind of emotionally tied to Eddie Brock. This is not her Eddie Brock, but this is in a lot of ways kind of the Eddie she could have had, right? In a lot of ways, they're a mirror for the life that she lost. And so that's when she asked the question, like, does your son have that same power? And the response of Eddie is, yes, he can do that, but he can't really be taken over by symbiotes. It creates a kind of feedback loop, and ultimately it causes him pain. But two, he's not an evil guy. He's not a bad kid. He's not a villain in the way that your son was. It sucks to say that, but he's not that way. Now, the issue with this is that Dylan overhears everything, right? Like the main Marvel Universe Dylan overhears them all. And for him, it's kind of crushing, right? It's crushing to hear that this alternate reality version of himself became such a horrible person, right? That, essentially took over the world. And that there's a concern that he could become that exact same kind of person, right? It's like if you were met with an alternate reality counterpart of yourself who was just a horrible human being. And the concern of everybody that you knew is that you would become that person, right? There's a part of you that screams out, I'm not that guy. I'm not going to be that person. But Dylan has never really met his mom, right? He never really met Anne. She gave birth to him, but like she ran off to Eddie Brock's dad and dropped the kid off there when he was a baby and then went and did herself in, right? And so he's never actually met his mom. And this one woman that he sees, that is the closest he ever came to meeting his mom, has essentially rejected him. This is emotionally crushing for really all parties involved here. The caveat to this is that as they're sitting down and as Anne just kind of says, look, I can't really do this. This is too much. And as she begins to leave, she's met by Venom Pool. And he's like, you guys have to go. And it's like, why? And it's like, because they tracked us here. Like they tracked you guys to your base of operations, right? Like you guys gotta get out of here as fast as you possibly can because they're sending someone here to take you out. And as soon as as Anne calls in the SOS, then suddenly you have Scorpion who pops in. Now remember, Matt Gargan was operating as Virus at the start of this story, right? He is the main Marvel Universe version of Matt Gargan, who has basically been taken over by a symbiote of sorts that was given to him by, or at least imposed on him by Codex, in order to track down Eddie and then bring him to Dylan, and then of course kill everybody else. And the issue with this is, like, as soon as they show up, all hell breaks loose. The caveat to this is that Eddie Brock is aware that the weakness of symbiotes comes in the form of like sonics or huge amounts of electricity or fire. And so what he ends up doing is grabbing like these live electric lines, just grabs them, and reads like those are electrical currents, right? Like no one can survive any of that kind of energy. His response is, yeah, that's what we're counting on. So he basically channels it through himself and shoots it out in what the Venom symbiote creates as a hand cannon, and basically takes out Mac, right? Takes out Mac Gargan. Then he calls on his son, do your thing. And Dylan seizes the symbiote off of Scorpion, takes total control of it, and then basically Mac Gargan reverts back to his normal self, right? This is a genius maneuver, but it's also exceedingly dangerous, because the more that Dylan uses his powers, the more susceptible to Knull he becomes. And that would allow Knull to reach in. Now, one thing, if I'm being honest with you guys, one thing that I think is really kind of going on here is, wouldn't it be interesting if Donny Cates followed the Jonathan Hickman Avengers New Avengers Molecule Man concept, right? In the sense that during Avengers and New Avengers, most of you guys know, there was one Molecule Man in every reality, and that origin of Molecule Man was the exact same, but he was designed to be a bomb that the Beyonders were going to detonate all at the same time and destroy the multiverse, right? But wouldn't it be interesting if it were the same concept with Dylan, that every universe has its own version of Dylan, and Dylan is unique among, in every single universe, in the sense that while his origin's not the exact same, although it may be in some way, that he has these powers, the ability to dominate the wills of symbiotes. He is in effect a kind of indirect heir to Knull, right? He possesses essentially the same powers that Knull does, even if not on such a grandiose scale. And that by having that kind of power, it allows Knull to basically take over Dylan, which allows him to control the symbiotes across every world. Wouldn't that be interesting, right? Every world and every universe. But as far as Mac Gargan goes, of course, when the symbiote's torn off of him and Eddie realizes it's Mac Gargan, then we kind of get a little bit of an explanation here, right? And the idea is that during Absolute Carnage, that as you guys remember, Mac Gargan's spine was almost totally ripped out and he was basically paralyzed. And Eddie left him there, right? And Eddie just left him there. You gotta go, right? He ended up taking off and leaving him there. And that's why Mac Gargan holds so much animosity, because he's like, you don't get to just walk away from the fact that you left me paralyzed like that. Now, admittedly, Mac Gargan was going to let like an innocent kid die, right? So, at the end of the day, Eddie Brock's like, I was kind of right for what I did. But the response of Mac is, you basically left me there that way. I could have recovered if I'd had a symbiote or something like that, but I couldn't, right? Like, you just left me paralyzed there and walked away. And so the response of Eddie, and this is really interesting, the response of Eddie is, fine, then we'll make you a deal, right? I'm going to make you a deal here. My son just killed the symbiote that was attached to you from Codex, right? So what we're going to do is you're going to take us to Codex. And then seemingly the bargain is, I will give you a symbiote or something like that, and you'll regain your ability to walk. I don't really know what the bargain is, but the idea is you are going to take us to Codex. And so seemingly Dylan is going to meet his alternate reality counterpart, and who even knows what's going to come out of that conflict? I have no earthly clue, because maybe we'll get even more of an origin story about Codex, right? And that's why it's kind of tentative here. Maybe we'll get a lot more information, because we still got 2 issues, I think, until this whole thing's done. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.